Binge watch and learn on TRS Clips. We've had a lot of people come on the show, Indian guys, Indian geopolitical commentators, who suggest that we're on the brink of a war with China. And so is America. I'd actually like to just have this as the last section of today's conversation.
Sure.
Have you thought about the possibility of a hot war, or do you disagree? Or is it unpredictable?
I've thought about it. For sure, I've thought about it. But I'd say this most important thing that India can do is to stay out of war.
The most important thing that any country can do.
I know. But basically, India is actually rational enough that it might listen. Now, with respect to India, India has, obviously security concerns on its border with Pakistan, but it's pulled away economically to such an extent from Pakistan that that's less of an issue than it was, right? A. B is Pakistan has had this coup from the US. If you saw that reported, right? Like it was rumored, but now The Intercept has actually got a lot of documents showing that the US just executed a coup in Pakistan because it didn't vote with them on Russia, right? And again, is it, the world's largest democracy or whatever? Come on. This is all basically vote with us. And if you don't vote with us, we will impose penalties, including deposing your leadership. We will depose your leadership so that you support our democracy. You know what I mean? We will dictate terms. So India fortunately was able to not just stand up to the US, but avoid whatever CIA, Black Ops type stuff they ran in Pakistan, which is a less well-organized society. So remember that, there's the game that you're seeing in public, which is, this diplomat says this diplomat says that. And they're like, why isn't India? India was under immense pressure to kind of buckle and conform. And it resisted, and didn't just resist, it resisted successfully enough. There is like, okay, you're too strong. We have to deal with you. We can't just dictate to you. This is also the attitude you should take with respect to the war stuff. Like basically, I'm of the opinion, look, I don't know every single detail of this border conflict. I've seen, a bunch of it. I know that they fight with sticks so that there isn't like a too much of an escalation. That's smart, actually. Both India and China are actually pretty smart for following that protocol because it limits the degree to which things can get out of hand between these two nuclear powers, right? With that said, I saw good signals that India and China were cooling this down, on the border thing. I know there's this map thing, and the map thing went really viral on Twitter, but sometimes it's not, to my knowledge, it's not like Xi tweeted it or whatever. To my knowledge, it's not like he had like a senior official post it and be like, this is ours, It could just be something that went viral and is being, perceived in the wrong way. Not to say that I think of the Chinese, I'm not like, remember I think Nehru said like Hindi chini bye-bye or something like that, right? That's like naive, okay? So I'm not saying that. But I am saying that in general, I don't think China wants conflict with India. I think they basically want India in BRICS, and they want India on side to de-dollarize, and they want to court India. Even if India, it's a little bit like in the 20th century where India leaned towards the Soviet Union, and it was left, but it wasn't communist, right? This is like the reverse, where it will lean towards the West and be capitalist, but it's not like all the way there. And in fact, it's smarter about it. It may be the most functional democracy. In many ways, actually, in some sense. All right, here's one. Okay, this will definitely. Here's a provocative statement, right? In many ways, after this G20 thing, you can make a case that Modi is actually the leader of the free world.
Ooh.
Okay, why is that? Because he was able to get everybody together for an agreement on Ukraine that nobody else was able to do. A, right? B, that happened in India, right? C, he also has a diplomatic channel to China and to Russia who will listen to him. America will listen to him. China and Russia will listen to him, right? Pretty important. Moreover, India, like Modi is more popular than Biden. He's more democratically legitimate if you talk about raw votes. He has more people of color and poor people voting for him than Biden does, right? Just in raw numbers. All of these kinds of things, you say this kind of thing and people are like, well, no, that can't be right. And the thing about it is because they define democracy as ruled by American Democrats. It's not the same thing. It's like during the Cold War, the Soviets defined communism as ruled by the Soviet Union. And what was Mao doing? Well, that wasn't real communism. That was a different communism. No, they're bad guys, right? Okay. Of course, they were also bad guys, but in a different way. In the same way with democracy, there's like, just to digress on that for a second, there's like 4 different kinds of democracy. There's blue democracy, which is American Democrats rule. Red democracy, which is American Republicans rule, like in Florida and Texas. They'll call it being a republic as opposed to being a democracy. There's tech democracy, which is like cryptographically verifiable on-chain voting. It's like, for example, something called snapshot.org on Ethereum, where you're voting on the blockchain, not just transacting. And there's Indian democracy. And in many ways, I actually think just like, Chinese communism was a second-rate version of communism, and then the Soviet Union fell, and now Chinese communism is like the number one brand of communism. I kind of think Indian democracy is like being the second most known version of democracy. But if there is a second financial crisis, which I think is coming, and US democracy takes a huge hit and is in internal conflict over lots of lost money and so on and so forth, I do think Indian democracy has a chance to become the world's leading brand of democracy in the same way that China became the world's leading brand of communism. Do you see what I'm saying? Right? Democracy with communism with Chinese characteristics, democracy with dharmic developments or something like. Okay.
Okay, then. This is what the entire conversation was leading up to, because my cinematic culture, which is also technically your cinematic culture,
Sure.
Looks at geopolitics in the world currently culminating into this war. And I've always had people on who say, a war's definitely going to happen, or it's definitely not going to happen. And what I've enjoyed about this conversation with you, and it's a big reason I've not interrupted, is that you do live thought experiments. Like I can tell that you're thinking about it as you're speaking.
Right.
When most people who are on the show, and I don't think it's a better or worse way, but they come on screen with their preconceived thoughts.
Right.
So I enjoyed not interrupting you, Balaji Srinivasan.
Okay. Well, hopefully that could be helpful.
Yeah.
On the war topic, I don't think the future is set. I think it can still be set by our choices, and I think India should absolutely stay out of war to the maximum extent it possibly can. And fortunately, I think the government right now is smart enough about that. And it's just, the thing is, you know why the US was so dominant in the 20th century? Everybody else fought. And the US was basically an ocean away. And it was the least devastated by World War I and World War II of any of the big powers. Right? By the end of World War II, Japan had been nuked and China had been actually invaded and smashed, and it had a Chinese Civil War after that. Obviously, Western Europe was just blown to smithereens. The UK, it couldn't afford its empire anymore. The Soviet Union everybody else had taken massive, massive hits, except the USA, which only lost a few 100,000 men, right? And so, yeah, it took a hit, and World War II, was still a significant cost to the US, the Pacific War in particular, but it was okay overall, right? And it was net stronger. And actually, that's why people romanticize 1950s America, like, oh, and one guy could work and, he could bring home the bacon for a family of this and that. Well, the rest of the world was totally bombed out. So his relative competitive advantage was so high, they didn't need any skills. And the guy who was like an Indian, physicist or a Chinese programmer equivalent today was like starving to death somewhere. Okay. Because their economies were ruined, right? In China's case by civil war and so on, India's case eventually by socialism and whatnot. And of course, the Soviet Union and then the West and the Eastern Bloc were all under communism, right? So all these other countries were held back by communism and socialism, and that's why the West was able to advance and stay relatively out of war. The US was able to stay out of war. Obviously, the West wasn't able to stay out of war, but the US was relatively able to be unscathed by war. That's a better way of putting it. The US is involved in a lot of wars, but the motherland doesn't get blown up by them. It's not touched. It's a TV war where you see it on TV, but it's not like Kansas is getting blown up, right? So India should be, I'm not saying India should be in lots of wars, but India should definitely make sure it doesn't come back.
There is a narrative that war boosts economies.
Oh my God.
That's one of the narratives that's been brought up on the show as well. But it causes too much suffering in the world. on a human level.
It's a word to, like, okay, so the thing is, this is the broken windows fallacy. Have you heard the broken windows?
No.
Okay. So Basquiat has this concept. It's like, let's say you've got a store and somebody smashes a window, okay? Then the store owner has to spend money on getting the window repaired. Okay, so you see economic activity. He's employing the glazier and so on, right? But that's actually, so he would have spent that money on something else, right? That's, you're seeing the activity and you're saying that's wealth creation. Actually, smashing the window is wealth destruction. And instead, the store owner would have built a new wing to his store if he didn't have to, fix this window, right? So war breaks windows, kills people. It's literally wealth destroying. The problem is people don't understand the difference. And sometimes we speak about it casually. I'm sure earlier in the video I spoke about it casually. But the difference between like money and wealth, did you know the distinction? Have you heard that before?
I mean, for me, wealth is a lot more than just money.
Yeah. Well, so
prosperity.
Right. So another way of putting it is the difference between like, better might be between money versus like goods and services.
Sure.
Okay. For example, if I give you, $1 bill or $100 bill and you give me an iPhone back, right? Money in a voluntary transaction usually travels opposite the direction of wealth, right? The good or service goes this way, right? And you have the money, but I have the good or service. That's usually what happens. And we count that part of the transaction, but this part is not usually conceptualized and such. And so the thing is, though, if you then blew this up and all we had was the dollar bill, then we'd be poorer off, right? We'd all be poorer. So war destroys that. The only thing that war does do, which is true, is it does force people to work harder, okay? But that's because it's like a tax, right? It says, okay, work or die, right? Because if you don't work really hard and you don't focus on the war effort, you might literally get blown up and imprisoned and so on and so forth. So work or die, right? So in that sense, the people who are into war are like, oh yeah, we had this wartime production and so on and so forth. Because people are essentially being told they'll lose their lives. It's like slavery in a sense, right? Where they have to do it because they don't really have a choice, or else they die. So it's a destruction of freedom, right? It's a little bit like conscription. That's another way of putting it, right? Rather than being conscripted into the military to fight, you're conscripted into the economy to build for the fight.
Gotcha.
Okay, so that's not good. That's actually, it's the kind of thing where there's a ton of propaganda that accompanies it to make you feel like it's good, but it's not good.
So TRS Clips has all sorts of videos and all sorts of playlists. Make sure you explore the channel by subscribing and heading to our homepage and reading through all the playlists. Happens through curiosity.